Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to FishOfHex. My name is Travis. Today's video, I'm going to talk all about why I decided to go with a DC pump as a feed pump for my calcium reactor. Now, as you guys know, I tried the Camor. It didn't work out, didn't have the flow that I was looking for, so I went back to the original CJ pump that came along with my Geo sump. And now I decided to go ahead and switch over to a mini DC pump per the recommendation of a local hobbyist who's actually been using it for quite a few years and been pretty successful. So in this video, I'm going to talk about why you might want to use a DC pump, the pros, the cons, and also talk about how you can add one and dial in your calcium reactor for the first time. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the first thing I want to do is talk about my experience with the two feed pumps that I've used over the last couple of years that this system has been up and running. Now, when the Geo sump came in, it was delivered with a CJ pump ready to go with the calcium reactor that also came with the setup. Now, this CJ pump is just a standard. It's on at 100%. Now, there is a little bit of an adjustment in front of the pump, but anybody who knows what I'm talking about is just, it's not a fine-tune adjustment. So simply leaving it wide open and then letting it go into the calcium reactor and then using the provided gate valve to control the effluent rate into the sump. So I went ahead and used this for quite a while, for at least a year or so, and it worked out fine, but it started to clog. And anybody who's been using a calcium reactor knows that the gate valves clog. They simply do. And the only way to really fix it is to open it all the way up, let the flow go through, kind of cleans it out, and then you can dial it back down. Now, there's two downsides to this. The first one is if it does start to clog and you don't realize it, your alkalinity can drop in your reef tank. Now, I test often. I test once or twice a week here in the fish room, and by testing, I can keep an eye on it and catch it early. But if you are testing once a month or something like that, it could start dropping sooner, and you could have alkalinity dips, which can basically kill your tank. So that's part of the issue that you have with a standard gate valve controlling the flow. And yeah, so doing that and dealing with that, it was just kind of a pain in the ass. So I decided to move on to the Camor. Now, when it comes to the Camor, the idea is pretty cool. The downside is I don't like that many mechanical features in my reef tank. I don't like depending on a pump that's got to continuously move. The downside is that the pump simply just could not provide enough flow for the tank. Even dialing the calcium reactor down, I did it temporarily and it still didn't work. Now that pump was on my system for probably 24 hours, maybe a little bit more. I don't really recall the exact amount of time, but needless to say, it did not provide the flow that I needed, and I was starting to get alkalinity dips in the system. So I had to pull it off and put the CJ pump back on. Now, with that said, after using the CJ pump and continually dealing with these gate valve clogging over and over again, I decided to go ahead and reach out to Nick, and Nick recommended, hey, try the DC pump. It's a small 530-ish gallons per hour. You can pick it up at Bulk Reef Supply. I'll put a link in the description, and hopefully I'll remember to put a link in the description. I'll put that down now on my list of things to do. And with this pump, you can control the amount of flow. So the point of having a DC pump is to simply allow you to control the amount of flow going into the reactor, and you can keep that gate valve wide open, preventing any clogging in the future. Now, let's go ahead and move on. I'll show you guys how I set up this pump, and then we'll talk about how I dialed it in, because it was a little bit trickier than I thought, and this is just something that you guys might have to deal with during this process. Now, when it comes to setting up the new pump, it was pretty simple. I just went ahead and took the existing 1/2-inch tube off of my CJ feed pump and attached it to the barb fitting on the DC pump. Now, this tube adapter-ish fitting actually takes the pump itself and dials it down to the 1/4-inch RO tubing, which I use to feed my calcium reactor. Now, because this DC pump comes with a whole bunch of different sized barb fittings, it was pretty easy to find the one to fit perfectly for this tube. And yeah, once I attached it, I used the provided clip that came with the original feed pump and then just reinstalled it into the sump. Now, after I was done installing the pump, I just simply attached the DC controller to the back wall next to my return pumps, plugged everything in, and now I was ready to see what kind of flow this thing would get. Now, I do use the FMM 1/4-inch flow monitor off of my calcium reactor, and that's what I was using in the past to really judge if the reactor was starting to clog, because the numbers would of course drop down in the apex, and I'd be like, okay, well, obviously something is starting to clog. Now it's time to open up the gate valve and see if I can flush it out completely. Now, I went ahead and turned this on and found out the flow was way too high. It was about 4.5 gallons per hour, which is a little high considering the fact I was at like 1.2 with the previous pump. So with that, I had to make some adjustments and dial a few things back to make sure I could still use this DC pump. Now, before I make any adjustments or major changes to my calcium reactor or this new feed pump, I'm going to go ahead and get a baseline for my alkalinity to see where I'm at. On top of that, I am going to start a new text document where I keep a detailed log of everything that I do over the next couple days or even weeks. And the reason why I want to do this is not only to kind of see what adjustments I'm making and how they impact the reef, but also for future reference. I can look back and I can also learn from this as I'm going through it. So I do recommend that you start a detailed log when you're making big changes on very, very important equipment like calcium reactors, feed pumps, or even just new CO2 regulators. It'd be important to keep that stuff on record so you know what you got to do to be successful. Okay, so let's go to move over to the calcium reactor and make some adjustments. Now, because there is so much flow going through this reactor, I can't keep the pH where it currently is. Now, what I have been running up to this point was a fluctuation between 6.7 and 6.8. Works pretty good for the reborn, and that's where it's been, and it hasn't been an issue, except for everything clogging up and eventually plummeting my alkalinity. But that's what we're trying to fix. So the pH up to this point, again, was between 6.7 and 6.8, and with the amount of flow going through the reactor, it was increasing my alkalinity at that current pH range. So I had to go ahead and increase my pH in the calcium reactor. That way it didn't dissolve as much media with that amount of flow, and of course hopefully bringing the alkalinity back down to where it's going to be stable. So the first day I went ahead and increased it from that original range up to about 6.85 to 6.95. That's about where it was for the first day-ish or so. Of course, I am testing my alkalinity every couple hours at this point because I still have a feeling that it's going to be too high, and that was confirmed when I was still testing. You can see we moved over to the 26 just one day later, and I increased the pH even more. Now I went up to 6.9 to 6.95, and yet again, you can see between the points on this graph that it was still too much flow going through the reactor. So again, I went ahead and increased it the last time because this is really as high as I can possibly go in this reactor without not being able to dissolve the media efficiently. So I went ahead and bumped it up to 6.95 to 7. So that's where it's been up to this point. Now, as you can see in the graph here, it was still too much flow. The alkalinity was increasing in the tank, even with the DC pump being turned all the way down, the pH being as high as it possibly can in the reactor that can still dissolve the media efficiently. Now, what was I going to do? Well, I wasn't going to turn on the gate valve because I didn't want to deal with it clogging. So what I did is I went to Home Depot, picked up a 1/4-inch ball valve, which is for like an RODI system, and I put it on the output of the DC pump right before it goes into the calcium reactor. Now, I dialed it down just a little bit, and at that point, you guys can see that the fluctuation in pH in the reactor started to take longer, indicating that the flow has dropped, and we will look at the FMM module flow here in a little bit. But what I did is I actually ended up dropping it down about 1.5 gallons per hour less is really where I was staying at. So about 3 to 3.2 gallons per hour was going through the reactor instead of 4.5. And at that point, we had started being pretty stable. And that's the way it's been for the last, I would say, 2 months. It's been what? This was on January 25th, and we're what? April 2nd now. So for pretty much 2 months, a little over, it was staying at the 3.2 gallons per hour. Rock stable, and the alkalinity was extremely stable because there wasn't any clogging, and I didn't have to make any adjustments up until a couple days ago, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. Okay, so let's go to move over to the FMM module, the flow that's coming out of the calcium reactor before it dumps into the refugium. And as you guys can see, I've been pretty stable, as I mentioned, around 3.2 gallons per hour. And again, it's been like that over the last couple months. Now, over the last couple months, I did go from 9.5 DKH to 8.5 DKH, and I didn't make any changes to the reef tank because I really wanted to see how this would kind of play out. Now, because I like to stay between 8.5 and 9.5, most importantly, I like to stay at 9, but again, for the sake of trying this out and figuring it out and learning from it, I just let it drop down to 8.5. Now, that was, of course, keeping the 3.2 gallons per hour and the current pH of 6.95 to 7 in the calcium reactor. Now, because I want to increase my alkalinity at this point, what do I need to do to make that happen? Well, because I still have the ball valve slightly turned on the output of the DC pump before it goes into calcium reactor, well, I'm just going to increase the flow and see what happens. So what I did is I opened up the gate valve or ball valve all the way, and you can see that I bumped up to 3.9 gallons per hour, and then I went ahead and cleaned the pump because I was like, well, I might as well clean it and see if I can get a little bit more flow out of it. And I did, and I ended up bumping up to 3.2, 3.3, or sorry, 4.2, 4.3, and then now it's kind of stabilizing around 4 gallons per hour. And Right now, I am seeing a slow uptake in alkalinity via the Trident. Of course, I am testing multiple times a week as usual with my HANA checker, and I am slowly increasing my alkalinity. So it's been, what, since the 28th that I made that adjustment. I went from 8.5, and we're at, April 2nd. I'm at 8.8 or something like that at the moment. Let me see what the last test was. Yeah, so 8.92, which just tested. So over that period of time, that's the adjustment that it made by simply just opening up the ball valve to give max flow through the calcium reactor. So you're probably wondering, what am I going to do in the future when I need to increase the alkalinity again, since I've already opened up the ball valve all the way and the pH is set where it is inside the calcium reactor? Well, I do have a couple options. One, because it is a DC pump, I'm able to increase the flow even further. As I mentioned, it is dialed all the way down, and I'm doing 4 gallons per hour through the calcium reactor without any restrictions. And so if I need to increase my alkalinity again, I can simply go over to the DC pump and dial it up until that's completely maxed out. At that point, I can then dial down the pH inside the calcium reactor to, of course, dissolve more media, dumping more calcium alkalinity into the reef tank. So those are the two options I have in the future. What I plan to do is increase the flow first through the feed pump and then dial down the pH just to make fine adjustments for that. But either way, I'm extremely happy with the DC pump. I have never had such a stable reef tank in my entire life. I mean, granted, it's only been like 5.5, 6 years. I keep saying 5.5, but that, time keeps going, videos keep making. Under 6 years of experience. And this is my first tank with a calcium reactor, and it has never been as stable as it is now since I've added a DC pump. And no more clogging, no more issues. The only thing you got to do is clean out the DC pump every once in a while, just like you would with your return pump. Simple maintenance. And yeah, extremely happy. So if you have a calcium reactor and you're dealing with clogged up gate valves, and you're just dealing with flow issues, one, get yourself an FMM module where you can see the flow. That way you can catch the problem early. If not, just test your alkalinity often. If you have a Trident, you're going to be able to see those dips either way. So I kind of got a backup. I got the FMM and the Trident, which allow me to give a good idea before anything bad happens, and then I can kind of jump on it early. But if you don't have those things, I do recommend at least getting the FMM, can't say that correctly today, and that way you can catch the flow early, or just go in there and clean out your gate valve often, once a month if you can, once every other month. You just want to make sure it stays clean. And yeah, so if you don't want to deal with any of that, just get yourself a DC pump and do what I do, because it is awesome and it works out really well. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, let me know, and yeah, I'll see you guys later. Peace.